Hello and welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe,
And I'm Dave.
and tonight we're doing something a little bit different from normal. I apologise for not having a mix beforehand. I know some people really enjoy that side of things. I know others would rather I didn't. But yeah, I just didn't have time today. I got caught up with everything, and by the time I had enough time to have a mix, there was 10 minutes left to go, and there was pretty much no point at that stage. But yeah, tonight we are. Where is it? Going to be covering off a something a little bit different. It's Josh, who's one of our long-time viewers. Back in the podcast days, we met Josh. Absolute legend. Basically gave us a link to this philosophy experiments, and it's 19 questions on morality thought experiments. You know, they're
Moral
moral
dilemmas.
dilemmas, basically. And they're just going to go through and ask you a bunch of questions. I haven't looked ahead of time at any of this. I haven't even read it out, other than the fact that it says morality play question 1 of 19. So I figured what we could do is I could share the screen, and what we'll do is we'll have a discussion about that. I want as much audience participation as possible, and I'm going to write down what I think I will say, and then after a discussion with all of you and the audience, we can have a look at what my answer is and see if it remains the same. So I think the first thing we need to do is quickly switch things up so that I can what's the word? Get things ready. Oh, hello Phil, how you doing, dude? Nice to have you here. And everyone else who's currently watching in, feel free to drop by and say hello. Right, we're back. It's gone slightly weird. There we go. Now we look normal. Well, I say normal. I don't think normal ever describes us, does it?
How dare you call me normal?
So, as I was saying, if anyone wants to join in with this, get your thoughts out there. I'm going to write down my answer. We're going to have a discussion about everyone's opinions on it. I'm not going to tell you mine until we get to the end of the discussion. Then I'll show you what I've written on the piece of paper. So, the first one, which I'm sure you can see on the screen.
Nope, it's barely visible.
It's barely visible for you.
Yeah.
What shall I make it a little bit bigger, like that? That works.
That's better.
Let's see. How does
I'm an old man. Got to remember these things. I'm blind.
Well, is that all fitting on? Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. All right. So, philosophy experiments. So the first one here says, you pass someone on the street who is in severe need and you are able to help them at little cost to yourself. Are you morally obliged to do so? So I'm going to write my answer down here, and we'll have a discussion about it and see what everyone else thinks of the case. So, Dave, what's your opinion on this?
Oop, there we go. Okay, there's a few ways you can answer this. You could go with something like the idea that there are no moral obligations. Everything's just whatever you feel like. So if you feel like you're obliged at the time, then you're obliged. And a moral particularist might say the same thing, that given the circumstances, there is a moral obligation in those particular circumstances because the person needs help. You can help them. It won't cost you anything. It's sort of a play on Peter Singer, I think, who argues that, you remember the one we mentioned the other week with OP, where it was if you're passing by a lake and there's a child drowning and the most it'll cost you is a wet pair of jeans, you have an obligation to save them. Um, and Cosmic Skeptic covered this one in his, and he mentions the rebuttal to Singer, which is the lifeboat ethics idea, um, where Singer argues that if you can help save someone without any real cost to yourself, you're morally obliged to do so. And lifeboat ethics argues that you'll just keep going and going and going if you're morally obliged until you're in the same circumstance. Because if you have an obligation to save the person in the street, you have an obligation to save people you don't know. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that. I would say weakly obliged because you can help that person. It, I don't go with the idea that you have to do it for everybody, but in that circumstance, if you can do it, then you have an obligation to help.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So looking at the chat, RB says, no, you're not obliged. Luke says, whoa! So, don't know what. Josiah says, I would do what I want. That was easy. Is there another Joe around? So, okay, that's all the engagement we've got on this particular one so far.
Well, I mean, a deontologist might say you have a duty to help them as well.
Mm-hmm. So what I actually put down for this one is strongly. Can you see that through there? I don't know if you can, but if you can, it says strongly. In fact, it probably is showing in reverse for you up there. I probably need to flip that camera. Anyway, I put strongly obliged because of the situation. So I think that I weigh up every situation. I'm not necessarily a particularist. I think I come closer to a value pluralist that wants to be a virtue ethicist. I want to be, I'm just not good enough. So I think that we do in that situation because it's a very little cost and they're in severe need. And I think, if we all helped people out, if it costs us very little, it would enable humans to flourish better. And I do think morality is about flourishing and well-being and being collaborative and cohesive, and all those sorts of things. So I would say that probably gives us a strong obligation to each other. Now, there might be similar circumstances where I might not say I have such a strong obligation, but I think that I'm still quite strongly obliged in this situation, this particular one.
I mean, if you're a utilitarian, you're sort of obliged to as well, because you can increase the amount of happiness. A consequentialist, you'd have to argue that, you have to help them because it's about bringing about the best consequences of any situation. And a virtue ethicist, you would be obliged to do it as well because honor, duty, that kind of stuff. And like you said, human flourishing.
Yeah, but that's why I would weigh up those and say that I feel that I'm strongly obliged, but you'd say you're weakly obliged to do so.
Yeah. Mostly because it could be the case that you can't really do anything apart from, say, call an ambulance. So that's as far as your obligation goes.
Right. I mean that it's always there's a bit of ambiguity in these thought experiments, isn't there? They're in severe need and you're able to help them. That, you're right, maybe the only thing you're able to do is call something, but I would assume that with their severe need, with it saying I'm able to help them, I'm able to come to a resolve for them.
Yeah.
So I would see in that there is a resolution that I can actually help them resolve the problem, and if I don't do it, Well, it says it's a severe need. So who knows how bad that severe need could be? And if no one else is around and no one else is going to help them, the only person that they're going to get help from is me. So I suppose it's the way that the pair of us have weighted the question.
Yeah.
Damn ambiguity.
Well, as a value pluralist, there may be something of more value that you need to get to. Like if you stop to help this guy, you could miss picking your kid up. So it's a little cost to you to not pick your kid up, but you still have an obligation to your child to go pick them up. So it's still little cost to stop and help, but there are other obligations that may be there.
Mm,
Like you said, it's an ambiguous question, doesn't give a lot of detail, but
yeah,
there are ways that you can bring it about so that it weakens the obligation.
yeah.
So I go with weekly.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, you should probably have it up yourself and fill it in yourself whilst I fill in this one. And then we can see what our
Hang
two
on.
results are. So coming back to the chat before we move on to the next one, Josh says, how do we maximize everyone's life experience? I mean, Josh is a consequentialist, so as we were saying, you probably, Josh, would be strongly obliged in that situation. Philip says it's always the middle one. I don't know. You must have done this. If the weak one is always weakly obliged, then you might be right. And yeah, Arby says it depends on the help that's needed, and I think that is basically the thing. The situation is ambiguous enough to well, we all put our own inferences on it. I imagined a situation that was slightly different to what Dave imagined. So the context I put on it, I would say I'm strongly obliged, but I would agree with Dave with the context he put on it that actually there would be a weaker obligation. There's still an obligation. But as I read this for me, I'm going to stick with my initial answer for strongly obliged. And Luke says, my mate Harry talks about higher moralities. Is this where that's relevant? And RB says, I thought of a crackhead. Yeah, I mean, does the fact that they're a crackhead necessarily mean that they don't need your help? You know,
And if the withdrawal is bad enough, then they're in severe enough need.
yeah.
But are you obliged to give them a tenner for a rock?
No. Again, what is the need? So yeah.
Yeah.
um. So okay, in that instance, I am still going to go strongly obliged, but with some of the other contexts you guys have given, I would agree that there is at least a weak obligation. In the crackhead one, going through withdrawal, I would suggest that no, we shouldn't give them a tenner for a rock, but maybe we could find some way to get them help. So, question 2: you have a brother. How did they know? You know that someone has been seriously injured as a result of criminal activity undertaken by him. James, seriously? You live in a country.
What a bastard.
You live in a country where the police and legal system are generally trustworthy. Are you morally obliged to inform them about your brother's crime? Someone's been seriously injured. Oh, okay. I got my answer. That's actually a tough one. I let's all take from this where they say seriously injured. Let's not go critical condition that's going to die, but they are severely injured in that regard. So, are you strongly obligated, weakly obligated, or not obligated at all? Luke says yes. So is that strongly or weakly then, Luke? Let us know. Dave, what are your thoughts on this one?
Okay. Well, we can move into something like the whole nationalism versus personal obligations type thing, or cosmopolitanism versus special obligations. Do you generally have a special obligation to your family that you don't have to your neighborhood or your country
Yeah.
or to other people?
I tend to think that we do have a slightly higher obligation to the people closer to us. Um,
Yeah.
so
So do you have an obligation to protect them
uh yes, but also you have the obligation to protect other people. So I mean from
from
this,
them?
yeah. So if they've been, if they have seriously injured someone, there's other factors that I'd like to consider with it. Are they going to do it again? Is this going to be a common occurrence, or is this just something that happened as a one-off? They say as a result of criminal activity. We don't actually know what that is. Was it they got in a fight? Were they burglaring someone? Um, or were they just doing a little drug deal that got wrong and they just get picking up an eighth of weed? Um,
And the guy tried to rob them.
yeah. So again, context matters, and we don't have that much context with this particular one. So uh, Luke and RB thinks you have a strong obligation to report your brother for his them being seriously injured during to criminal activity. So guys, how would you justify that yourselves? I'd be interested to know. And anyone else who's currently listening in as well. I mean,
Like,
uh,
because you have a duty to your neighborhood and that kind of thing.
yeah, your camera's randomly frozen. Oh, it's back. Yeah. Do
Oh,
you
did you
have a
hear
duty?
any of what I just
No,
said?
it all came through. You just froze.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. All right. So, whilst they're typing out a response, if you guys are going to, you don't have to. You've got no need to justify yourselves. There you go. Luke says they need to be held accountable for their actions. Cool. In that regard, do you think that punishment is, or criminal punishment, um, serving jail time is what it's about, or do you think it's about rehabilitation? And do you think rehabilitation in this country actually happens through jail time? Could there be other ways to address this? But as Luke has qualified, providing that the justice system is trustworthy only. And I think that is possibly one of those things. Like, it does say the legal system are generally trustworthy. So I would include that legal system in the punishment side, the conviction
Yeah.
side. They actually rehabilitate rather than just chuck away the key. So I think that makes sense, Luke. Fair play. I actually went in for this one. I put down week, just so you can see. I think we've got a weak obligation because we do have an obligation to protect the others around us. But we also do have an obligation to our family. And again, it's the context that matters for this. And you know what, the chances of my brothers even engaging in any form of criminal activity is very rare. So again, I'm putting the context of my brothers in this. The worst it's going to be is they've gone and got really trolleyed on a night out and done something stupid like stolen a Boris bike and done something like that. So in that context, yeah, there's still a weak obligation to maybe report them or to convince them that maybe they should fess up to what's being done. But I don't think there's a strong obligation there. Now, if the context was again changed and I happened to have a brother that was a bit of an evil bastard, bit of a psychopath, then I would say that there's a strong obligation that this needed to be done, dealt with. So
Well, let's throw one in there. Would your brother have an obligation to not put you in that position?
yes, but if he was a proper psychopath, he probably wouldn't. It wouldn't matter to him.
Yeah. But again, the context kind of matters. They have an obligation not to put you in that position where you would have to do that.
Mm,
You have an obligation to your neighborhood. You have an obligation to protect your brother, so help him kind of get better and help him get him on the right track. It's quite a difficult question, really, like
mm.
all moral dilemmas.
Yeah. And like all moral dilemmas, you're just like, give me a bit more context, man. Like, tell me a
Yeah,
bit more about it. Because, well, we all are putting
but
our own inferences on this, aren't we? And we're all seeing it in different
yeah,
ways. And then we're having the discussion and we're like, but what about it could be that. Going based off this as it is, I would say that there's a weak obligation.
I'd go with strong, just because it would be the virtuous thing to do.
Fair? You're in alignment with the chat. Apparently, I like my brothers better.
I don't have a brother, so I don't have that kind of bond. So
It's quite easy to be objective when there's no emotion involved. But
yeah,
I can.
I ate my brother in the womb.
And thus an atheist was born. um, so, number 3. Do you think that assisting the suicide of someone who wants to die and has requested help is morally equivalent to allowing them to die by withholding medical assistance, assuming that the level of suffering turns out to be identical in both cases? Yes. Oh, I shouldn't have answered before anyone else.
Yeah, it's all right.
Sorry. Um, I mean, it's not as simple as that. I think it's the same for them. It's not necessarily the same for you. Um, because you might still feel bad about assisting their suicide, even though it's the right thing to do. You know what I mean? So morality wise, I think the morality's the same. But how it might affect you on an emotional level might be different. I didn't even write down my answer. I already answered yes. But I will write down that one. Sorry, guys. You want us to read it again? Okay. Do you think that assisting the suicide of someone who wants to die and has requested help is morally equivalent to allowing them to die by withholding medical assistance, assuming that the level of suffering turns out to be identical in both cases? So assume that someone's lying in the bed and they say, please help me die, and you have to do something, say whether you either get upping their morphine or you have to strangle them, whatever it is, suffocate them, maybe bit better than strangling them, or you know that they're going through these fits, and if you happen to not give them medication during one of these fits, they will die. In both instances, they are going to feel exactly the same amount of pain and suffering as they die. So is the morality exactly the same, or is there a difference? So Josh says no. Luke says yes. Philip says yes if requested help in both instances. Luke did raise a point earlier on, though, saying, one, you don't have consent. Yeah, I assumed that there was consent in both cases. So, like a sort of a do not resuscitate type thing, by withholding the medical assistance. So there you go. We've both inferred slightly differently there. I have inferred that in both instances they want to die. But it doesn't actually specify in the second example that they want to. So are we supposed to infer that they want to in both circumstances?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So for the sake of this one, in both circumstances, they definitely want to die, and the level of suffering is the same in both cases. Then I'm going to stick with yes if we're saying that in both circumstances that they consent, which is why you corrected yourself there, Luke. Opie says one's passive and one's active euthanasia. It's basically the same. Luke says, yeah, it's absolutely the same, providing we use the least painful method possible. Josh says, bodily autonomy, they're making a request for their own body. Although Josiah says, not equal, bonus points given for respecting the wish of the patient, not wait for extra for death. So you don't
Yeah.
think they're equal in that regard. So what about you there, Dave?
I go with no for something similar to what Josiah just said, in that one, you're administering the help that they've requested to help sort of end it sooner. And in the other, you're just allowing it to happen. You're just being a bystander. It's like, well, I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to sort of help you die, but also not going to help you not die.
Hmm.
Whereas with one, you're saying, yes, I will help relieve your suffering,
A good
which I
argument,
feel is the more
actually.
moral. Yeah,
See, in my head, again, this is the context I put on it. Um, I would say that I again thought that whatever happened would happen around the same time. I either help them die and they die within the next 5 minutes, or I allow them, or I withhold medical assistance and they die within the next 5 minutes. But what you say there, actually, sorry about that. What I say there, what you said there is right, actually, because allowing them to die by withholding medical assistance, even if that's what they wanted to be done, that could still take an extra couple of weeks. However, what it says the level of suffering turns out to be identical in both cases. So that means that for that couple of weeks, they're only going to suffer the same amount. So, in some respects, if you allow them to die, they get 2 weeks extra life as well, and it's the same amount of suffering.
yeah, but the quality of life is different.
Mm. Yeah, I suppose it depends on.
If it's if it's not a good quality of life, and you help them end on their own terms, isn't that better than leaving them those extra couple of, say, even extra 5 minutes with a lack of quality of life?
Mm. No, I think on that one you've convinced me. I'm actually going to change my answer to a no. So I'm gonna mark on my little paper that I think that they are exactly the same in the sense that if they were to happen in the same time frame, but we can't guarantee the second one is going to happen in the same time frame. So, and I would assume, as you mentioned, Dave, that if you're just allowing them to die, it is going to take longer, and they probably don't have the same quality of life in that regard, and they might be miserable for that time, and that could be why the level of suffering turns out to be identical in both. They might be miserable for the next 2 weeks or however long it takes, and then they drift off in their sleep. But that's why it's done. So okay, yeah, um,
I mean, there is arguments where, because the level of suffering is the same, there would be no moral difference because you're judging the morality based on how much suffering is happening.
mm,
So think of something like a utilitarian or something.
yeah, no,
It's a difficult one.
it is, and I think that's because there's no timescales in it as well. That's why I said in my initial gut reaction was these two things are going to happen about the same time. And if they were to happen in the exact same time frame, I would definitely say that they are the same. But they're not quite. We can't guarantee that they're going to be the same. You know, there needs to be a middle option in this one. depends
Yeah.
on context. I'd probably click that for every single
E-
one.
Everything does, though, doesn't it? That's why these are written in the same way that something like the trolley thought experiment, in that they're very vague, and you're
Yeah.
just bringing out an intuition and looking at that intuition and then building on that intuition.
Mm. Yeah. Um. Yeah. 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 Which is why they're bloody hard.
Yeah. There is no right or wrong answer. And I think that's where a lot of people trip up on things like this. They're looking for the right or the wrong answer when there is no right or wrong answer. There is only the creation of discussion.
Mm. Which is great. I love a moral discussion. Just getting back to the chat as well. Opie says Rachel says no, as in no distinction, so she sees them the same herself. And I did until the very last minute. Um, yeah. So Philip says, wouldn't being alive for that long add up to the suffering? So not equal. Yeah. Yes, that's exactly what we were just discussing. What if it was a drug that also would take 2 weeks? So,
Get better drugs.
yeah. Hey, Leon, how you doing?
Hey, Leon.
So cool. All right. You've convinced me. If the time scale was exactly the same between the two, then I would continue with my answer of yes. But with the fact that chances are allowing someone to die, even if they don't necessarily suffer that much more, their quality of life, if they're in that state, may not be particularly great. So I can understand why they're not different. So I have changed my answer from yes to no. Well, there you go. I mean, at least, even though I shouted out my answer straight away by mistake. Okay, so number 4. You are able to help some people, but unfortunately, you can only do so by harming other people. The number of people harmed will always be 10% of those helped. When considering whether it is morally justified to help, does the actual number of people involved make any difference? For example, does it make a difference if you are helping 10 people by harming one person rather than 100,000 people by harming 10,000 people? So when considering whether it is morally justified to help, does the number of people involved, so it's 10% regardless. And the question is asking, does the actual number out of the percentage? So 1 in 10 versus 10k in 100k. Right. So I suppose in this example, are we agreed that this is the only way that people can be helped for whatever reason, and you're weighing it up, and regardless, you are it's asking if the total number of people harmed, so it's still 10% either way.
Is
Um,
there a moral difference between saving 9 people and harming 1 and saving 90,000 people and harming 10,000?
mm-hmm.
Is there a moral difference?
That's what it's asking. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got my answer.
Um, I would say it really depends.
Of course, it depends.
Of course. But
But you know,
I mean, if you think about something like the current pandemic, imagine if 1 in 10 suffered and died from an anaphylactic shock. I know it's nowhere near that kind of number. Um, but 2 in 10 died if you didn't. So wouldn't it be better? I mean, the numbers don't really make much of a difference as such. Um, harming 10,000 people is the same as harming one person in this instance. But the level of suffering changes, so that might change the morality.
Yeah, it as for me, it definitely depends on the sort of help that you can do and the sort of harm. So, I mean, if we were to just put something in there, let's say the harm is essentially ruining a life, and the help is making a life, amazing. In this regard, and so is it if you ruin one life but improve 10 lives massively, um, and you can inflate that, so ruin 10 lives, but make 100. Is there any difference between that? Now, couple of comments in the chat. Josh says the number shouldn't matter. Luke says I don't think it's different, it's always 10%.
But the level of suffering would be greater.
Philip says I don't think suffering scales in the same way as happiness, which is basically what you're saying there.
Yeah.
I mean, if we were to have it in equal proportion, potentially, and also what about the ongoing consequences? What if it's it is so hard, as you say, on the context. Now,
if you just boil it down to, though, 1 in 10 suffers, is it less moral or more moral when it's 2 in 20? I mean, the amount of suffering has increased, but also so is the amount of happiness.
So my opinion on that one is no, because it's 10%. 10% is 10% is 10%, and I'm assuming that it is an equal scale either side. I'm not saying you'd necessarily do it though. I'm saying that I don't see a difference in the morality of 10% regardless of the number if all things are equal. So if it's a balanced either side. But I can think of examples where I wouldn't harm one person for the sake of 10, because harming that one person is just, in my head, more immoral than what the benefits that it would give for those 10. I mean, if we think back to like the doctor problem, which is harming one healthy person to save 5 patients, and the ongoing knock-on effect of doing that, breaking the Hippocratic Oath and all of that sort of thing. I think that no, you wouldn't do that in that situation, and in that regard, doctors obviously have a duty to do no harm. So, I mean that's looking at a higher percentage. That's looking at 20%. So I'm going to stick with no for me on that one. I don't think that there's, all things being equal, and I know life isn't that simple. As Philip rightly said, suffering doesn't scale in the same way as happiness. That's fair. I'm going to go with this example. It is scaling the same way. So the morality doesn't change. That doesn't mean I would do it though. That doesn't mean I would harm one for to improve 10, or I'd harm 10,000 to improve 100,000 lives. I don't necessarily agree with doing it, but I don't think it necessarily changes the morality until you have more context. Is that Where are you on that one, Dave?
I put yes. It does make a difference because the overall amount of suffering is greater. So there is a difference in the value and the the qualitative sort of element. Each individual might not suffer more, but if we collect all the suffering together, it equals a greater amount.
Yeah,
So there is a slight moral difference, but not necessarily in the way that it affects the moral outcome.
yeah, fair. Right, before we move on to the next one, we're going to take a really brief break. I will be right back.
Do you need?
Eat a shit.
You forgot to mute. Hello?
Hello. And we're back in the room. Sorry about that. Oh, new subscriber. Hello, Roger. Thank you.
Thank you.
So where were we? Yeah, so on the previous question, Philip says, I guess it depends what helping does. Increases happiness or removes suffering. Yeah. I mean that's why these ones are particularly hard, aren't they? There's too much ambiguity to really nail down a decent response, and all we can do is put our own inferences around what it means. But
And that is the point of moral dilemmas, to bring out those inferences and intuitions.
Yeah. And that's why also, I mean, they're a good exercise, but it's why if actually any of this happened in real life, you might have more of an inclination about what you would do, but it isn't necessarily what you would do because you'd
No.
have more context and you'd have more emotion going on. And your emotions can completely fuck up your cognitive processes and make you do something you wouldn't usually think you'd do. So so here we go. Number 5. You own an unoccupied property. You are contacted by a refugee group which desperately needs somewhere to house a person seeking asylum who is being unjustly persecuted in a foreign country. Your anonymity.
Anonymity.
Call me Nemo. Your anonymity is assured. You have every reason to believe that no harm will come to your property. Are you morally obligated to allow them to use your property? Interesting. So is it a strong, weak, or no obligation? So, guys, what do you think? They're still talking about the last one. So Luke says yes. 1,000 times yes. So I assume that that's probably a strong obligation that you feel there. Then, just from that. What about you, Dave?
This is probably going to shock a lot of people, but I'm going to say that you're not obliged. The
Oh wow.
government is who is morally obliged. Um, you, it would be morally better for you to do it, but there is no obligation for you to do it.
Hmm.
Because the obligation is on the government to make sure that they're homed and protected.
That
But it's something you ought to do, not obliged to do.
yeah. No, that's a good distinction. What about if it was the government contacting you in that regard? They knew that you had that. Would you have an obligation to your government?
Um, I'm not really one for saying you're obliged to your government for a lot of things. Um, but in that case, yes, because it would mean that the government has found you probably the most suitable.
Right.
So you have an obligation to help protect that person if asked.
Hmm. Interesting. Um, uh, Josh says, yes, you're obligated. OP agrees with you, not obligated. And Luke says, stop throwing curveballs.
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I love a conversation about morality. It really gets you thinking and checking your own biases and also checking what you might have missed from the situation. Um, if there's no more coming in, I'll tell you what I said and why. Um, I put that we have a weak obligation um, because I think that we're still obligated. We have an obligation to other humans in general. I think the further away someone is, the weaker the obligation is. But I still believe that we have an obligation to other humans all the same, even though it is the further away it is, the weaker the obligation is. Um, I agree with what you say, Dave, about the morally ought. Um, I'd say it's probably a stronger ought than I would have with my weak obligation. Um, but I still think that there is some form of obligation that we have to each other. And if a refugee group has contacted me, well, how the hell did they find out that I've got this house? They must have been searching around. And if they've been searching around and they've found me, blimey, they must be bloody desperate. And if I am the only person that could help out in this situation, um, then this person's quality of life will be shit unless I allow them to stay in this unoccupied property. So I think that we have a weak obligation in that regard. I understand what you say about how it's the government's obligation, though. Um, that does make a lot of sense. But I'm going to assume that the government's been shit.
Well, just to throw in another curveball, what about property rights? Do you have the rights to your own property to do as you please with?
You do, which is why
Then
you can
how
still
can you
say no.
Yeah, but if you're obliged, it means you can't say no.
Even a weak obligation, does that mean that you can't say no?
Hmm. It's weak as in the strength of the obligation. So you still have an obligation to do it, even though it's a weak obligation.
As Luke says, what if the government are Tories?
And they should be overthrown and strung up on the wall, Handmaid's Tale style.
Could we do that by getting enough refugees in our house to overthrow the government?
Yeah,
Do we have an obligation to overthrow tyrannical governments?
you do.
So, in that regard, if the way we do that is by getting refugees in to overthrow our government, would we then have
Well,
a?
you personally don't, because you don't have that capability, and ought implies can.
Mm.
Um, but a government who has the power to overthrow a tyrannical government is obliged.
Josh says can't say no or shouldn't say no. So what Dave was saying there was if you have an obligation, then I mean you physically can say no, but you can't say no. In
You're
that,
breaking your obligation then.
yeah. So that's why Dave was saying you ought to let them in, but you don't have the obligation there because he said you've got your own property rights, and actually this sort of thing should be dealt with by a government, not by a member of the public.
If approached by the government, you should, because it means they need your help, and it by asking for your help, it sort of creates an ought that you should do, and perhaps an obligation that you should do.
Hmm,
Um, but you could be obliged only to the point where you keep them there until they find a better place for them.
yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I actually agree with you. I'm going to change my answer. I still think you ought to do it. I definitely think you
Yeah.
ought to do it, but I agree with you that there isn't actually the obligation there. Um, I do think we have an obligation to others, but in this regard, I don't think that this is necessarily the best way they could have done it. I still think you ought to do it, but you don't have that obligation. Um, so I mean, Josh, with what you're saying there, where you say can't say no or shouldn't say no, if you have an obligation, you can't say no, even though you physically can. You can't say no. You still ought to do it because it's the morally right thing to do, but there is no moral have to, if you want. There's a difference between an ought to and a have to. So if you think about obliged, it's a is there a moral have to? And I agree with what Dave said there. So there isn't a moral have to, but there is still a moral ought. So I'm gonna go with that one. So that's two I've changed my mind on through conversation, and three that
I'm good
I've
at this.
maintained. So, number 6. A charity collection takes place in your office. For every £10 given, a blind person's sight is restored. Instead of donating £10, you use the money to treat yourself to a cocktail after work. Are you morally responsible for the continued blindness of the person who would have been treated if you'd made the donation? Are you responsible, partly responsible, or not responsible? So this is, it's along the lines of the first question, but from a different angle.
Yeah.
And this is interesting actually because this one gives you all the context of it. And it's not saying are you morally responsible for them being blind? It's asking if you're morally responsible for their continued blindness. So you could have helped them, but you decided not to, and they are going to continue being blind. Are you morally responsible for their continued blindness? Are you responsible, partly responsible, or not responsible at all? At one, I think I might end up changing my answer to this one, um, because I've gone with an instant gut, and the conversation is what's going to make me think about this in more detail. So I can see this one being one I probably will change my mind. So, on the previous subject, Philip says, "What's the difference between weak and strong if you have to in both?" Um, well, that's what I was sort of getting at with you earlier, wasn't it, Dave? On that one, on the previous subject. Um, It's a weaker have to.
Yeah.
You still have to. But if there's a stronger obligation that is in, if you have a weak obligation here and a strong obligation here, what it would say is the strong obligation would override the weak obligation. So, say if you, back on the previous question, it was you either gave it to the refugee or you actually housed your family and their children and things like that. You have a stronger obligation to your family than you do, say, a refugee. So in that instance, I would say that your family would override the house being used by a refugee. So that's where I would say the difference between, say, a weak and strong obligation is that sort of along the lines of what you think, Dave?
Yeah.
Ah, excellent. um, so going back onto this question, Opie says you're not responsible for their continued blindness. Philip says you're responsible. Leon says you're not responsible, but you're still a dick. Luke says I would say not responsible. Leon says I don't understand how being partly responsible works. Okay, so in my head, partly responsible would be there could be someone else that stepped up at the same time. There could be other options. There could be it's 10 quid. If 10 quid is what's gonna cover their cover their blindness, why can't they pay for it themselves? Or yeah, all those other options. There could be another, there's other people there in the room with you that could have also done it. So in that instance, is that what it means by partly responsible? That's what I inferred from it. What about you, Dave?
Yeah. You could also go with partly responsible because you didn't cause their blindness. It's just that you could have helped end it. So by not helping end it, you're partially responsible for the continued blindness. But because you didn't create the blindness, you're not wholly responsible.
That's exactly why I put down partly as my answer. I was going to wait and say that justification at the end, but there you go. But that's why I'd go with partly on that. Josh says his first thought is partly. Philip says, say there would be an ATM that hands you 10 quid every time that happens, and someone magically becomes blind. Luke says it's the government's responsibility. So Philip goes, yeah, would you be responsible for the blindness in that case where, an ATM that gives you 10 quid every time it happens, but someone becomes blind? I mean, do you know that they're going to become blind if you take this tenner? In that instance, you definitely are responsible. Man, where are these magic ATMs though?
Did you ever watch a show called Sliders?
I did watch Sliders, yeah.
You remember the episode with the life lottery? Where you could
Yes.
take as much money out of the machine as you wanted, but
Yeah.
the more you took, the more chance you could be killed to help curb the population.
Yeah. Yeah. That was kind of cool episode actually. They had some
Yeah.
great conundrums in these various different worlds. I also remember
It
the
was a
one
binder
where
for the first few seasons.
yeah. I also remember one where everybody on the planet was a lawyer or something like that.
Yeah.
That was really weird. Some of the worlds were obviously quite unrealistic, but some of them were actually like shit, just a couple of changes in our history, and I can really see the world being like this.
Like the pilot with the communists.
I can't remember that one off the top
The
of my head.
very first episode was he slides into a world where communism beat the Americans after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh man, I tell you what, I've actually had the seasons on my Amazon list for ages because I really want to rewatch them all because they're great. Absolutely love that show.
But
Yeah,
yeah, it's sort of like that. But if you think about this, the ATM one, if you took a tenner and you knew who would be blind and you still took it, you're responsible. But the the randomness of who becomes blind is also partially responsible for them becoming blind. You haven't specifically chosen that person to be blind,
yeah,
but you have chosen for a person to be blind.
yeah. Which is why you'd be partially responsible because someone has set up a system where an ATM will blind people. I mean,
Sounds like the Tories.
yeah, yeah. Cameron says, "Hey Cameron, if my 10 quid would save someone's sight, it sounds like a lot went wrong before that point, so I'd say no responsibility." Um, Bearded Heretic says, "Well, it's continued blindness, not blindness, so you're not changing their current state." Philip
It's
says,
just that you could fix it.
"Yeah, you could fix it." So are you responsible for it not being fixed? That's the way to think about it. Are you responsible for them not changing it? Um, Philip says, "I don't think there's a distinction between refusing to help when you have the ability to and causing the harm." Um, Josh says, "Richer people in the world need to lower their wealth to your level for you to be responsible." That's a good point in certain
Yeah.
regards. Yeah. Um, so yeah,
Yeah. I mean, if a tenor can cure a blind person, I'd say Amazon not giving up their billions would be more responsible than you going for a cocktail after work because you've had a hard day.
yep. So that's why. I mean, I said partly. Um, so I think that we are partly responsible in this regard, because it is from their existing state. There are other people who could put the money forward. There is there are other options, as you say. There's companies that make absolute billions, and if it's only going to cost 10 quid to cure someone, then well, why should that have to fall onto me? You know, there are these massive corporations. I mean, the company they're coming into our office, right? Well, you know what? My company knows how much they pay me, and I know how much my bills are. And actually, that 10 quid, okay, I've decided to spend it on a cocktail after work. But you know what? Maybe that's the only cocktail I can afford that week, and that's the only way I can unwind. And that's my little treat to myself for having to put you know, I can think of loads of justifications. I still think it's kind of a selfish justification, if I'm honest, because 10 quid for curing someone's blindness, fuck yeah. You know, if 10 quid could cure someone, yeah, you're a bit of a dick for, especially if it's having a cocktail. You know, if it was like, well, actually, this 10 quid is all I've got, and this is supposed to feed my family tonight, that's a different story. But if
You,
it's sorry,
oops, sorry, but if it's
yeah, that's a different story. But if it's like, you know, 10 quid to versus to cure someone's blindness versus having a cocktail, you are a bit of a dick for not doing it. But I would still land on partly responsible.
yeah, I mean, you could throw in something like a Nozikian argument here as well, where it's you are the one with the rights to the fruits of your labor, and nobody has the rights to tell you where it should go. Um, and it would be the same with big businesses. So you have no responsibility to spend your money to cure them, but you're still a bit of a dick for not doing it. But I would go with partly responsible as well.
There.
If you knew who was going to be cured and you didn't do it, you would be wholly responsible.
Would you?
Yeah, because you know who it is and you could cure their blindness. So you handing over that tenor would cure them. So you are responsible for not curing them.
Right. So you think the randomness there doesn't? I mean, uh, I'm not sure that it would necessarily change the answer whether it was random or consistent. Um, just because, again, all the other things that I mentioned before, with all the other businesses, the places that you work, and all of that, I think you're still partly responsible, but if you know them, I'd say you've got more of an obligation.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, okay. So I think let's carry on. Let's go back to the chat and see what they're all saying. Oh, random thing popped up there. You can't be responsible for all other people's plights, though, says Luke. So have we all caused harm? I think that's a very apt point there. We can't be responsible for everyone else. But in a situation like that, they're giving you an opportunity to help someone out. So you can't be responsible for every situation that's going on in the world. But in a situation like this, where you can have a direct curative effect, is there a part of one? As Philip says, Peter Singer has entered the chat. OP says the blind person you cure becomes a murderer. No, OP, let's not add that context in there, because from a consequentialist point of view, you're then responsible for their murders as well. It says, are you responsible for the murder? Right, so it depends on the moral theory you apply. I would say no, but I can understand how you could be. Yeah. Okay, let's move on from this one. I think, Dave and I are in agreement that there's a partial responsibility here. So there you go. I expected to change my mind on that one through the conversation, but I didn't, which is nice. Someone you have never met needs a kidney transplant. You are one of the few people who can provide the kidney. Would you have a moral obligation to provide the kidney? Oh, sorry. Would any moral obligation to provide the kidney be greater if this person were a cousin rather than a non-relative? Well, I think you all are going to know my answer there, because I've addressed it in a couple of the previous experiments. But what do you guys out there think? What do you think, Dave? 2 minutes. 2 minutes, Turkish.
Sorry, was yeah. No, I was just responding in the chat.
Fair.
This one sort of goes to something like the violinist experiment when it comes to bodily autonomy. So I would say you have no moral obligation to give your body to somebody else to save their life. You ought to if you can, but you're not obliged to do it because it's your body, your choice.
It's not asking. So, I mean, in this one, it says, would any moral obligation to provide the kidney be greater if the person was a cousin rather than a non-relative?
Oh, sorry. I misheard that bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, but I suppose in this one, are you saying that there's no moral obligation regardless of who they are anyway?
Yeah.
Fair enough. What's the chat saying? RB is saying yes. Josh is saying no. People are people. Emotions suck. Leon says emotions are cringe. Josiah saying my kidney costs 75k if anyone needs it. Bearded Heretic is saying no. So generally, people are saying in the chat that there is there's no difference in the moral obligation to provide a kidney to someone with between your cousin and a non-relative. The moral obligation is the same. Do you guys think that there is any moral obligation, though? So, or are you going along the same lines that Dave was and saying that there isn't any moral obligation either way, and that's why it's the same? For me, I think that we do have obligations to families. I understand bodily autonomy. I suppose again we're going back, and I'm getting. I see moral obligation, and I keep thinking moral ought. I see a difference in the moral ought. So I've actually written down yes, and I'm going to change that one. And I agree with what you're saying. There is no obligation to give up your any part of your body to anyone else. So I do agree with you. I'd say that there is a moral ought that is stronger for a cousin rather than a non-relative. Would you agree with that?
Yes, to some extent. You would feel the pull more. Um, it would be more intuitive that you owe more to your cousin than to a total stranger.
Hmm.
But do you owe your family something simply by virtue of them being your family? Especially as
Oh no, we've lost you. Especially
oh,
as
am I back?
yeah, you're back.
Especially as it's a cousin you've never met, as stated in the first sentence.
Ah, you know what? I completely missed that one as well. Um, so a cousin that you've never met, that does change it quite a bit. And yeah, yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, I'd say that a cousin that you've never met versus a person you've never met is no real different because I see family as being something closer to that, and I'd see family not necessarily being just by blood anyway. Um, family are the people that you choose to be around you. Um, so the fact that it's a family member you've never met, they're only family by blood
Oh,
in this regard. And I
can you hear?
would, yeah, are you okay?
Yeah, it seems it's my turn to have technical difficulties tonight.
Yeah. So, yeah, you've never met, and I suppose in this instance you know nothing about them, about either person. So I'm changing my answer from yes to no on the obligation part. I'd say that there is an ought to do it because you've got two kidneys, and you're helping someone out, and I do think you ought to help someone out if you can. But I wouldn't say it's a big ought because obviously it's an encroachment of your own bodily autonomy, and the fact that you don't know either of them makes it a really small ought. So that is where I'd go with this one. Um,
I mean, just to throw a bit of a spanner in here, if you were to use the argument that a woman has no obligation to bring her fetus to term because it's her body, um, but you also argued here that you had an obligation to give your kidney to your cousin, um, you would hold a contradictory position.
this is true. Yeah. Um, yeah. As I said, when I first wrote yes, I where it said moral obligation, I in my head I instantly jumped to moral ought. Which is why I agree with you that there isn't actually the obligation there at all for either of them. Um, so in that regard, there is no obligation. There might be an ought, and depending on how well you know them, it depends on the type of ought. Back to the chat quickly. Whoa, God, you guys wrote a lot in a few seconds. Um, Bearded Heretic says no, but it would feel like there is, and I think you're right that it might feel like there's an obligation, but I think that the feeling of the obligation is more the feeling of you ought to do it rather than an actual obligation existing there, and I think that is something that we need to try and separate cognitively, and I'm talking about it myself because I am constantly, when I see moral obligation, throwing in a moral ought. And that's not what we're talking about when the obligation comes up. You know, do you morally have to do this versus should this be what you're doing, morally speaking? So, yeah. Philip says, what is the difference between you ought to do X and you have a moral obligation to do X? So, in that regards, it is like I just said, when you have a moral obligation, you're basically saying that this is something that you have to do. You're obligated to do it. You know, so if you have a moral obligation to, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Pick up a glass. There you go. Everybody has to pick up the glass. Whereas if you only ought to pick up the glass, well, I should do it. It's immoral for me not to pick up the glass, but you know, I don't have an obligation. I'm not, and I think it's stronger. You know, if you want to think about it in terms of a moral ought is what you should do, and a moral obligation is what you have to do. So that's why I changed my answer on this one, because no one has to give up any of their body to anyone else, even if they should do it. Does that help, Philip? Hopefully. Yeah, Leon, your question, what if your cousin is a total stranger? I mean, that's what it was supposed to say in that. In that instance, your cousin is the total stranger. Philip says, I think no as well. Yeah, Computer Brain says, a family member would likely be a better tissue match than the stranger. And you're right. That is one of the things with what's it called? Donating body parts. You know, being a close family relative, especially. Even then, it's not always an exact match. But that tends to be the way it goes with those sorts of things. Luke says, what if your cousin is the crown prince of a distant country and will offer you 5 million for your services if you send over 150 quid to pay for legal fees? If you fall for that one, Luke. Josiah says, how about if your cousin is shitty and the bum kidney haver is a saint? Well, in this instance, you don't know either of them, so there you go. And Opie goes, that's Pascal's mugging. That was an interesting one when I read Pascal's mugging, actually. Have you read that one, Dave?
Yeah. Opie sent it to us not long ago.
Oh, cool. See, at least I remembered it. To be honest, when he sent it to us not long ago, I actually was reading it and went, I swear I've read this before, because he'd sent it to me previously and I'd read it and I just didn't remember what he was talking about when he brought it up again. But that's an interesting one to pick up at some point, but I'm going to leave it off there. If anyone is interested in Pascal's mugging, ask Opie for a copy.
Yeah. Or we could put it in the repository on the Discord server.
That's true, actually. Sorry. So, morality play, question 8 of 19. You can save the lives of 1,000 patients by cancelling 100 operations that would have saved the lives of 100 different patients. Are you morally obliged to do so? So this is a different take on the doctor problem. So if you listen to what I was saying about that earlier, you might know what my answer is. Whilst they think about their responses in the chat, Dave, what's yours?
I would say no, because you've already you would be breaking an obligation you made to those patients you've already promised to help.
Anyone out there in the chat land want to weigh in on this one as well? What do you think? Are you morally obliged to do this? Manny says, hey, Manny, by the way, how you doing? These questions can get crazy. Yeah, they can do. It's interesting looking at the different way people think about them as well. I think that's one of the things I enjoy about them most. Not only does it point out the odd flaw in my own reasoning or just pick up something that I didn't consider, you can really, really see the way it's doing it. So, Bearded Heretic is saying, "Can we fund the NHS?" No. I wish we could, though, and I wish we'd give them all a lot more money. They deserve it. They have to put up with wankers like me all the time, and do you know what? I'm not even the worst patient there is. So, yeah, those guys.
We could if we weren't giving the dodo bird a £10 billion to create a faulty track and trace system.
Or paying politicians as much as they get.
Yeah.
Okay, so there isn't anyone joining in on this one, really. So I will come up with my answer, and I have written down no as well. So on this one, you've got it's essentially the doctor problem. You've got your Hippocratic oath, so you've got your duty, your obligation to do no harm. Cancelling the 100 operations will do harm. You already have that obligation for those patients, as Dave said. So you're already there. You've already given yourself that obligation. And I don't think it creates a higher obligation to these other people. What?
I think you could, sorry, I think you could throw in some particularism here and say that if canceling one of the patient's operations and it wasn't particularly necessary, but canceling it could save the life of another person, then you're morally obliged to cancel that and save the person's life.
Yeah, yeah. But in this instance, you know, it would have saved 100 lives. So, um, it's not a case
Yeah,
of
it's a different situation, but that's
yeah,
why I was going into particularism.
yeah. Yeah, and again with all of them, if the context was different, or more explained, then yes, of course, it would change the answer. So Cameron says, "Well, save 1,000 or save 100. I wouldn't give up my kidney to save my family, so no." Fair play. Cool. So I think we're generally in agreement with that one. There is no moral obligation, especially because you have a higher obligation that you've already ascribed to with the 100 patients that you already have on the list. Number 9. Are your moral obligations to people in your own country or community stronger than those to people in other countries and communities, assuming no unusual circumstances? For example, suffering because of famine, either in your own country, community, or in the other countries or communities. So let's just say you've got a carbon copy of your own country that's a different country. So it's exactly the same, but it's just a different country. Do you have a higher moral obligation to your own country over another one? All things considered, everything else is equal. I think you guys already know what my answer is going to be on this one as well. But I'm open to having my mind changed. Josh has come back on the previous one, and saying just ask the other people if you can cancel their shit. I mean that's fair. I mean you could ask 100
Yeah.
people. You know, if do you mind dying for the sake of 1,000 people? That's fine. You can ask them. There's nothing wrong with that. But I don't think that's necessarily that's a bit different to what's actually going on in this hypothetical. Philip says, "Is it guaranteed that the 1,000 are going to die if you don't do this?" Yeah, in that previous in previous situation, yes, I think so. You know, there are 100 people that are booked in for operations, and you can save them uh, by letting them have their operations, or you cancel those 100 operations, which then for some reason allows you to save 1,000 other lives.
I mean, if you think about that, it goes back to the one in, is there a difference between 1 in 10 suffering and 10 in 100 suffering? It's that 10% thing again.
It is that 10% again, but it's got a different context, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
you've already got an obligation there, from the medical procedures, from the taking the Hippocratic Oath, the do no harm, the fact that these people, you've already agreed to save 100 people, and now you're going to go, oh, actually, I'm going to kill you, because you effectively would be killing those 100 people to then save 1,000. So it is a bit of a different situation. It's the same sort of thing. It's the same 10% thing, but it adds more context to it. But on yes, Philip, it is like the trolley problem with 100 on the safe side and 1,000 on the kill side, but it's more like the doctor problem. So, I mean, with all these thought experiments, there are a number of different ways that we can look at it, and there's a difference between the trolley problem and the doctor problem. So, if we think about the trolley problem, it is quite clear cut. You can get different answers through different ethical theories, but for the sake of it, you've got it's going to kill 5 people, and you can switch the track, and it kills one instead. With the doctor problem, you have to actively kill someone for a perfectly healthy person for their organs to then save 5 people. Now let's assume for whatever reason, those people will definitely survive the operation and live long, healthy lives. But what you've done is you've taken an innocent without their consent. You've broken your Hippocratic Oath, and you're going to break the trust of the people. And they are going to be unwilling to go to the doctors just in case they're perfectly healthy and the doctor decides, do you know what, I'm going to, harvest your organs. There was actually a show when I was, a TV movie, when I was younger, that scared me of going to doctors, because there was a room, like room 8, where during the operation, they, for 8 seconds or something like that, or whatever it was, stopped the oxygen and put carbon dioxide in, so essentially made you brain dead, so that they could then harvest your organs, and sell them on. And that actually scared me, because what if they're going to do that? I didn't want to have the operations that I had as a kid just in case they did that to me. So obviously that was a bit of an irrational fear, because it was just a movie, but that could happen. And I think if doctors were to actually go, well, actually, yeah, do you know what? I'm going to kill you to save you 5. It would have an ongoing negative impact. People would stop trusting doctors. I mean, there's already enough anti-vaxxers out there. Do we want to compound the problem? So
Yeah. With regards to the trolley problem, the previous one was something more akin to pushing the fat man off a bridge to stop the trolley to save the 6.
apparently Computer Brain remembers that movie. And it was carbon monoxide, not carbon dioxide. Well, there you go. I'm not talking out my ass. Which is odd, because I usually am. So on this particular one, so let's get back to number 9. Are your moral obligations to people in your own country or community stronger than those to people in other countries and communities, assuming there's no unusual circumstances? So for the sake of this one, let's just say your country and a carbon copy of your country, but it's a different country. Okay, so are your moral obligations stronger in your own country? Luke has turned around and said patriotism is silly. I'd agree with you, but I don't think that is enough to change my answer. He said it again. Patriotism is silly. So I think that you there, Luke, will say that there is no difference whether they're in your country or not.
He's a cosmopolitan.
um, Yeah, and Computer Brain says nationalism is worse. I think it depends on the type of nationalism. I think nationalism is normally worse. but that's because of the way it always transpires. Dave and I actually did a stream on nationalism and about how if you applied it in a right way that was actually more moral, you could have a good form of nationalism.
Martha Nussbaum promotes something called benign patriotism. And I generally go with something like Samuel Schaeffer's kind of weak nationalism, um, in that we do have special obligations to our community, our family, our friends, our community, our country, and applying those properly could actually be a better way of ensuring that aid gets to another country.
Yeah. And I think I'd agree with that, and I think that's why I lean towards yes on this question myself. Um, because in your own country, your family are there, your friends are there, your community's there, you live there, and actually, if you can get your country to a good state, then your country is in a better state to help out other countries. Um, So I personally think that we do have more of an obligation to people in our own countries, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a stronger, like massively stronger. I'd just say that there's a little
No,
bit more of one, just a little bit more. But because there is a difference, I will say that my answer on this is yes, even though all of you have said no.
but also I'd like to throw out that the BNP, EDL, David Duke, and all those kind of people can fuck right off.
Of course I can. Um, yeah, we're not talking about that. I mean, if you
We're
really
not talking white nationalism. We're
no,
talking a weaker form of nationalism.
yeah. I mean, if you want the context of that, because I'm sure some of you might be going, "What the fuck are the?" I thought these guys were all right, but they seem like right dicks right now. Just check out that stream, and you'll understand exactly what we're talking about in that regard. Because yeah, we're not talking about the way it's usually applied in any society, because the way it's usually applied is incredibly morally wrong.
Bad, yeah.
Yeah. Um, so
Check out Martha Nussbaum's benign patriotism. It's very different to what most people would consider patriotism.
yeah. And yeah, I'll move on from that one. I'll let you guys make up your own mind. But I think in that regard, I think everybody's going to be against us for that one. But number 10.
Probably. I was against it until I actually read the literature.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I went into my master's and that block going, "Oh my god, how could anybody promote nationalism?" And then I read Nussbaum and Schaeffer and people like that, and I thought, "Okay, I can actually get behind this.
Yeah.
Not what most people see, but this."
Um. So on this one, number 10. Oh, what's happened there? Who's jumped in? Oh, it's Three
3 Vikings,
Vikings.
1 atheist.
I haven't set up the stream for third person right now. I haven't locked it. Doesn't matter. I don't mind if we're looking slightly odd.
I always do.
So, you deliberately sabotage a piece of machinery in your workplace so that when someone next uses it, there will be an accident which will result in that person losing the use of their legs. Are you morally responsible for their injury? I mean, that one's quite clear cut, isn't it?
Yeah, this is something akin to what Philip mentioned about the ATM.
Yeah. Um. Yeah, but obviously with a yeah,
With an
no.
added level of responsibility because you've gone out of your way to sabotage the piece of machinery.
Yeah. Um. So, I think you and I are very much on the same page in that I can
Yeah.
guess what Philip is going to say in regards to this one as well. Um. Anyone else want to weigh in before we say what we're going to say?
Everybody's left because we talked about nationalism in the course of the day.
Cameron says 100% responsible, but what? But what?
What in the butt?
Luke says, what if they're Gary from Pokemon? Well, you're still responsible, but you might deserve it.
I don't know. I don't play Pokemon or watch the cartoons, so I don't know.
He was just an annoying character from memory.
Yeah.
Oh, hang on. What's that word? So you could look at it as the other person being lackadaisical. I don't know that word. Do you know that word, David?
Nope.
Oh, there you go, Cameron. You've taught me something new. And not checking the equipment. I assume that it means someone who's just basically hasn't done there's been careless and not checked the equipment beforehand. And that's what you're trying to refer to here. Which could well be the case. Let's have a quick Google at what that means, shall we?
Like the person afterwards, it could be their responsibility to check that the equipment is fine before they start using it.
Lacking enthusiasm and determination, careless and lazy. So yeah, that's what I said at the beginning. They're lazy. They're not doing their what they ought to. Their checks at the beginning to make sure that everything is working as it ought. Cool.
But even if they don't check it, the person who sabotaged it with the specific intent of
that happening,
causing the injury, yeah, it's still their responsibility entirely.
Yeah. Fair. Right. So, I think that you're fully responsible in this regard. Sorry, Three Vikings. I'm just for the sake of this one. I need to go out. If I do that, no, I can't get you to remove from this one. I'm just going to give you a kick. You can join us later when we switch things back. But I need you out of here just for now because it's messing up the stream slightly. But more than up for your input on anything. That's not letting me do anything, Dave. I seem to not have any abilities. So anyway, you deliberately sabotage a piece of machinery in your work. So I think you're fully responsible in this regard. Because you have done everything you can. You know what's going to happen. You may not know that it's going to hurt their legs, but you know there's going to be an accident. And in fact, even here, it qualifies it that when someone next uses it, there will be an accident which will result in that person losing the use of the leg. So it seems like you might even know that is what's going to happen. So I'd say that you're fully responsible. What about you, Dave?
I agree.
Yeah. And I think from what Philip was saying earlier with his ATM example, he would agree. Cameron agreed that you're also 100% responsible, but he did say the other person should have checked the machine first, which, in that sort of thing, you're using heavy machinery in that sort of role, you would be. I think Opie can qualify that one for us. He's a machinist, so there's probably certain checks that you ought to do before you start your day. So Josh also agrees that you're responsible. So it looks like in that one that we're actually so far unanimously in agreement. So there you go. Do you know what would have been great if you guys were actually filling this one in at the same time as well, like Dave has done his one, and just see what I don't even know if there's any results at the end of it.
Neither do I. I've not gone through this yet.
No, but I wonder if it gives you a little chart and it goes, "Oh, you're this type of person."
You're a cunt.
Yeah, we knew that already, though. Right. You know the identity of someone who has committed a serious crime resulting in a person being badly injured. Are you morally obliged to reveal their identity to an appropriate authority so that they are dealt with justly? I mean, this is the same sort of thing, except it's not a family member this time.
Yeah. Basically, it's seeing whether you think you have a stronger obligation to protect your family than you do an anonymous person.
Which I do to an extent. Regardless of what the obligations of your family have to you, I still think you have a stronger obligation to your family. We need to lock the room whilst we're in a stream, don't we? I've still got it open for guests at the moment. Right. I'll have to change the permissions before the next stream just so I remember. Can you alter the permissions whilst I go through this? Because whilst I've got the screen up, it doesn't do it. It's not letting me actually change anything. In fact, I can actually remove their permissions though from here. No, it's not letting me change roles either. Okay, yeah, for some reason it's not letting me do anything. Actually, Philip, seeing as you're not in the stream, could you alter the permissions on SciPhi just to take the SciPhi guess out for now? Just for now. So
We'll bring you back in afterwards through Vikings One Atheist.
Yeah, you can come back in afterwards. We're just right now it's messing up the visuals. So going back, we've got some answers on Josh says yes. So I guess that's strongly obliged. Bearded Heretic says yes, you should. Philip says yeah, strongly obliged. So I also went with strong. So I think you have a strong obligation there. Now I know that with my brother, I said that there was a weak obligation. So I think that there is a difference between the two. But I think most of you said you had a strong obligation regardless last time, didn't you?
Yeah.
So it's largely only me that's had the change in the answer. But yeah, I mean it's the same thing. The only difference is whether if it's your brother or not. So I think we can move on from that one quite quickly. Number 12, you can save the lives of 10 innocent people by killing one other innocent person. Are you morally obliged to do so? So this is interesting. They're an innocent person. There's not enough context, I think, with this one of what it is.
This is the trolley problem.
It is the trolley problem, but I'd still approach the trolley problem with an ought rather than an obligation.
Yeah, I agree.
So with this, I'm still thinking about ought versus obligation. And I've written down my answer of what I think about the obligation. So Leon says questions like these, and you wonder why I don't like ethics.
This is why I love ethics.
Yeah. OP's back. Welcome back. I asked you a question about being a machinist, but it doesn't really matter. It's kind of irrelevant now. Luke says this is like the one Jordan Peterson uses to prove atheists are murderers. Is it? I don't really listen to anything he says, so I'll take your word on that. Okay, so Manny also said maybe no. Okay, I have gone with no as well, because I don't think that you are ever obligated to actively kill someone, especially an innocent.
Yeah.
So that's why I think there isn't a moral obligation there. But whether you ought to do it, I'd need more context. I can see arguments for doing it. I mean, if it was, say, for example, the trolley problem, I think you ought to pull the lever. If it's the trolley problem with the fat man,
Are you obliged to push him in front of it?
I don't think there's an obligation. I'm sold on this. The answer being no, but ought you have to push the fat man? You know, pulling the lever, I definitely think you ought to. Pushing the fat man off there. I think there's probably still a bit of an ought, but not as much of an ought.
Ought implies can, and I'm not strong enough to push a fat
man. So yeah, I mean, on the obligation side of things, I think we're generally in agreement that there is no obligation to kill someone. But depending on the context, maybe you ought to do something. So let's save that for the next one. And I'm going to have to just go into be right back briefly. Hey, Maverick, just great to have you here. So I am going to be right back. Give me 2 minutes. Right, we're back. Sorry about that, folks. What happened to my jam? What's that, Leon? Is that I think it should be a random playlist, although I don't know what's playing. I've put on a few ones. If there's any tracks that you don't like, then let me know. It was just because it was always the same track playing all the time, so I've changed it. Um, but yes, so question 13. You see a charity advertisement in a newspaper about a person in severe need in Australia. There is no state welfare available to this person, but you can help them at little cost to yourself. You have a good reason to believe that any help you offer will make a difference. Are you morally obliged to help the person? Hmm. Uh, okay. I got my answer. Maverick says, no, but I would help. And I think that's a fair answer. I mean, just for context, I've put no there. But you two, I don't think there's an obligation. I think you ought to help if you can, but I don't think that you're under any obligation to help either.
It's the morally right thing to do.
Yeah.
Rather than the thing that you have to do because it's moral.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's it'd be interesting if they did this test, but then they did the same one again and with ought instead of obliged.
Yeah.
Because my answers would definitely be quite different if we were talking about oughts.
Same, yeah. One way to look at this one is every time you see a GoFundMe go past on your Twitter feed, are you morally obliged to give money to that GoFundMe? Because it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, and I'd agree. I don't think that you're obliged to do so. I think if you can, it's not going to cost you anything, then you ought to. And not even in every circumstance either. I mean, because if you helped out every single cause that went past your feed, you'd end up with no money to even eat. So
you'd be writing your own GoFundMe.
Exactly. I've spent all my money on GoFundMe, so I need my own GoFundMe to fund me, so I can fund other GoFundMes. Yep. Yeah. Cameron also agrees. No. So that one was kind of quick and easy. That's nice. We're not obliged. You are required to send a person a gift, and you bought a bottle of drink to send them. However, you discover it is poisoned and, if consumed, will cause blindness in the drinker. To replace it with a non-contaminated bottle will cost you 10 quid. You have the poisoned drink. You give the poisoned drink as a gift anyway. Are you morally responsible for the blindness of the drinker? I mean, I know this is sort of a different take on the one earlier, but in this instance, we're saying we know if you're getting a gift for someone, you know who they are, right?
Yeah.
So if you know who you are, and you actually you bought a bottle of drink innocently in the first instance, you didn't know it was going to blind them, but then you discover it will blind them. So and then you decide to give it to them anyway, knowing it's going to blind them. Are you morally responsible? I think that one's quite cut and dry.
Yeah.
Just quickly check the chat to see if they have answered. So Maverick agrees that yes, you're responsible. If you can prevent it after finding out it's poisonous. Yep. Manny also says yes. I'd agree with you. I'd actually go, you are responsible, not even partly responsible. Philip also agrees, yes, you are as well. Dave, I imagine you're in agreement with that one.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Luke says certainly.
As soon as you find out it's going to blind them and you don't replace it, you are responsible for what comes after.
Yeah. You have become aware. You become an active agent in that particular one. So yeah, that one was. they're getting easier as we go on. I thought they were going to be getting harder and harder. The earlier ones were like ambiguous and all sorts, and it was like, oh, would it be? Would it be? Um,
It draws out your intuitions and then kind of narrows them down to look for consistency.
yeah. A situation arises where you can either save your own children from death or contact the emergency services in order to save the lives of 10 other children. You cannot do both, and there is no way to save everybody. Which course of action are you morally obliged to follow? Now, this one's actually a complicated one. So there we go. I just complained about they weren't getting complicated. Do you go down the path of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or do you go down the path of your own children are more important than other people's children?
And that you have special obligations, as was mentioned earlier.
It's a tough one, because I think regardless of what you're obliged to do, what you would do would be save your own child.
Yeah.
But as to what you're morally obliged to do, I don't know. I genuinely don't know this one. Like all the others, even if I've changed it later, I had a gut instinct of what the moral obligation was. I know, well, I probably, in that situation, I would save my own child. But I don't think that's necessarily right for what you're obligated to do. I think I would probably be acting immorally in that circumstance, unless I could somehow justify, as we were talking about earlier, with the special obligation. But is that special obligation to one child, does that outweigh the lives of 10 children all the same? I think, yeah, I obligation wise, even though it's not what I would necessarily do, I'm going to go with the obligation should be to the 10 children. But in that situation, I would probably take the less moral path and save my own child. What do you think?
Save your own child.
Would you say that you actually had the obligation to save your own child there?
Yeah. Because you are its protector.
So you think there is an additional obligation that outweighs the obligation to the 10 kids? That
Yeah.
interesting.
I go with Schaefer.
Right. Are you going to elaborate?
You brought the child into the world, and there's a there's a contract that you're supposed to look after that child.
Mm-hmm.
You're supposed to protect it, make sure it's well, and as close familial relation, you have that extra obligation to look after your own child. You should save 10 other children, but you have that obligation.
Yeah, interesting.
I mean, I'm an antinatalist, so nobody should be having kids anyway. They're fucking horrible little monsters. So that would solve that problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm still stuck on thinking that even though I would save my own child, I still think that you probably have a higher obligation to the 10 other children. But I like the fact that you justify my gut instinct to me.
Most people would understand you saving your own child as well.
Yeah.
Most people would consider you to have an obligation to look out for your own child.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm still not sure if we do have a higher obligation to the single child, though. I understand what you're saying about being the protector of your own child. Oh, yeah. I'm still really stuck on the obligation side with this one. Anyone in the chat? you know. Um, so Maverick says, I think you should save your own child since you are your own child's guardian, so your own children, which makes sense. That's along the same lines of what you were saying, Dave, that you have the higher obligation to your own children. He also before that said either is moral. Most would select their own due to attachment, and I mean that's what I'm saying. Like I think that saving 10 lives is probably the more moral thing to do. But I would, in that instance, save my own child. And I'm trying to work out whether the obligation to your own child is that above saving 10 other children. Cameron thinks that you should save the 10, but emotions would definitely be pulling me towards my own child. Manny asks, are you with your child and not with the 10 kids? It doesn't really say that. There's a situation where you can either save your own child from death or contact the emergency services in order to save lives of 10 other children. So that's all you've got. So Maverick says, yeah, you have a duty for your child first and foremost. Luke says, what if your child's a little shit? Cameron says responsibility is greater than morality. I'd say it's moral responsibility or duty is what we're talking about there. So that's what we're talking about with the obligation. You have a moral obligation to your children. But do you have, I mean, if it was a 1-to-1, it's a much easier question to answer because you have a higher obligation to your own child. The fact that it's the 10% thing again, I would still say that I think we have a higher obligation to save the lives of 10 children than our own child, but I would still save my own child in that situation because, selfish bastard and emotional attachments and all that sort of stuff.
Okay. Let me throw something else out here as well then. Think about the ought implies can statement.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're making a moral judgment and having moral obligations and moral duties, our psychology plays a big part. So our psychology might not allow us to not save our children. So we cannot do else other than save our child.
Mm.
So the psychology creates a problem with the ought implies can. So if you cannot do it, are you morally obliged to do it? Just
I,
to complicate it a little
I,
bit further.
I don't know.
But if your psychology will only allow you to save your child, then that has to be taken into consideration with regards to the obligation.
Yeah. I suppose if we were to sort of go away from this entirely, we would say that there are certain obligations that we have to each other as a standard, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
But if someone was significantly mentally ill, we might say that they don't have those obligations because they're not processing information in the same way.
Yeah.
We might still have an obligation to them to look after them. It might be a different or stronger obligation to look after them, but we would say that they don't have an obligation back to us because they can't process it in the same way.
Yeah.
So that's me agreeing with you, basically. So, essentially, because I'm mentally ill for my own child.
It is essentially something like that.
Yeah. Cool. I'll change my answer on that one then.
Your genes and your physiology and your psychology and everything overrides any kind of rational thinking.
Yeah. And because of that, you don't have the same obligation. So we've got
because you can't fulfill it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'll go with that. So before that, Josh says, I'm with Joe. Would save my kid. Do emotions get in the way? I mean, they definitely do, don't they?
Yeah.
Maverick says, it would be tougher if you could save your own child from an atrocity, e.g., losing their legs, or save the actual lives of multiple other children. Um, yes, because your child would still be alive and just legless, and you've saved the lives of 10. Yeah, that would make it a lot more tricky.
Yeah.
And I still think in that situation, what you would do would probably still be save your own child, but running on pure instinct. But yeah, Leon's got a good alternative. Save none of them.
That's what I said. Just don't have them to begin with.
But the Stroop effect, Dave. Cool. All right, you changed my mind on that one. So far, 4 out of 15, you guys have managed to change my mind on.
And a bunch of them you just agreed with us anyway. So
yeah. You can save the lives of 10 patients by cancelling one operation, which would have saved the life of a different patient. Are you moral? I mean, that's just the exact same one, but with a smaller number. So, do we even need to go through much deliberation on that? Seeing as exactly the same. So, for the last one, so when we saw it before, it was save the life of 1,000 patients by cancelling 100 appointments. But we've already agreed that no, there's no moral obligation because you have the moral obligation beforehand to the people that you've already agreed to save. And it's like we were talking about with the doctor problem. I don't think you need me to repeat that one, guys, do you? So let's move on to 17. We're down the last couple of questions. You own an unoccupied property. We've heard this one. You are contacted by a welfare organisation which desperately needs somewhere to house a person from a nearby town who is being unjustly persecuted. Your anonymity is assured. You have every reason to believe that no harm will come to your property. Are you morally obliged to allow them to use your property? So, that is basically the same question as before as well. So I think we can probably run through that one quickly.
it's checking for consistency with the one before, which was a slightly more cosmopolitan, and with your choice against your beliefs about special obligations.
But I would probably answer the same as we came to the conclusion in the last one, and
yeah,
that you're not obliged. I think that one was I originally was going for a weak obligation, and you guys changed my mind to there being no obligation, even though you might have ought to have done it. And I think that's what I came to the conclusion before. There was a weak ought, but no obligation, and I think that's exactly the same for this one.
Yeah, you ought to do it, and the government is obliged to offer these kind of protections because that's the role of the government. But
yeah, no obligation. So the chat, Maverick says no, Cameron says nope, and I'm assuming all the rest of you are nodding along in agreement because I think we were pretty much unanimous on that one in the end last time. So number 18. Oh, look. You become aware that a piece of machinery in your workplace is faulty, and that if it is not repaired, then there will soon be an accident which will result in someone losing the use of their legs. Despite knowing that nobody else is aware of the fault, you take no action. Shortly afterwards, the accident occurs and someone does lose the use of their legs. Are you morally responsible for their injury? So in this instance, it's the previous one was you're actively affecting the machinery to cause this accident. This one, you are aware of a fault in a machine that needs repairing, and you take no action, so it ends up in the same result. are you morally responsible for their injury? So
It's the difference between pushing somebody in front of a bus and allowing them to step out in front of it without stopping them.
it is. I think it's a bit different.
It's about committing harms and allowing harms to happen is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean,
And it's sort of the same as abstaining from pulling the lever in the trolley problem.
yeah. But as we say in the trolley problem, as soon as you're aware of a problem, you become an active agent within it, and inaction is still a form of action.
Yeah,
Um,
in this case as well, you could say that there should be somebody responsible for the safety and the checking of the machines and upkeep. And there is in a workplace, there's sort of a health and safety obligation from the company itself.
hmm, yeah,
But and so it's that person's obligation to check and make sure all the machinery is okay. Um, but sometimes things are overlooked because that's just the way humans are. So I'd say you're partly responsible because you should have spoken up, and you not speaking up has resulted in the thing. But your reasoning could be, well, it's that person's job to do it.
yeah, interesting. Manny says responsible. Um, and then this one should specifically be for Opie. Yeah. uh, Maverick says yes, they're responsible. It's different because they're reliant on you to provide the machinery. Yeah. I think that you're responsible in this situation. It's not your fault that the machinery's broken down. Um, but because you're aware of the fault and have decided not to speak up, like, even if you didn't repair it, you should have done something like, this machine's fucked. You know, put a banner on it, let people know not to use it. And I think that is why you're actually responsible. Luke says responsible. Manny says responsible. Leon says partly responsible. I do understand the arguments for partial responsibility, because you weren't responsible for the fault happening. So I just think it's just because you've got to the point where you are aware that this thing is going to happen. And I assume you know that not repairing it is going to cause such a horrific accident as well. It's not like you're looking at it and going, no, that doesn't work. Doesn't it right? I assume you're like, shit, if I don't say something, someone's going to lose their legs. Fuck it, I'm not going to say anything.
Think back to the other experiment where it was the guy who knowingly fiddled the machine so that the next person would be harmed. Now, this one is speaking about a person who's come to know that it's happened and it happens. Is he fully responsible, or is it the guy who sabotaged the machine that's responsible?
Yeah, I mean, if we're going from the context of that, so it's not the natural breaking down of the machine, it's someone's actively gone in there and fiddled with the machine and then someone else after it. There is a shared responsibility there. I suppose, again, it depends on the context, because these machines do break down naturally as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I see what you're saying, though. Context matters. um, I mean, I think there's a lot of responsibility that goes around. Is it inconsistent to say that there can be a shared responsibility of everyone being 100 responsible at the same time? you know, um, I suppose in that regard that, yeah, okay, even if they may be mostly responsible, that's mostly is still only partly other than wholly. So if our
Yeah.
if responsible is 100% and partly is anywhere from 99 to 1%, then no, I'll agree with you there. I will change from responsible to partly responsible. Josiah, no worries. Hope you have a good one. Maverick says it would be
Take it
equivalent.
easy, Josiah.
It would be equivalent to the government not telling us about risks and dangers of COVID in order to keep the economy running. Yes, indeed. So, question 19. You can save the lives of 1 million innocent people by killing 100,000 others. Are you morally obliged to do so? So that's the same one as before. I'm just going to go with that. That's where we were on that one, weren't we? Does anyone? Yeah, I think no. So
yes to the no.
You have now answered all the morality play questions. We just need you to answer a few questions about yourself so that we can analyze your answers properly. Are you male or female? I don't know. What is my nationality? What religion are you? No religion? Suppose that'll do.
Yep.
My moral parsimony score is 70.
Parsimony.
Parsimony, thank you. What does this mean? Moral frameworks can be more or less parsimonious. That is to say, they can employ a wide range of principles, which vary in their application according to circumstances. Less parsimonious, or they can employ a small range of principles which can apply across a wide range of circumstances without modification, so they're more parsimonious. An example might make this clear. Let's assume that we're committed to the principle that it is good to reduce suffering. The test of moral parsimony is to see whether this principle is applied simply and without modification or qualification in a number of different circumstances. Supposing, for example, we find that otherwise identical circumstances, the principle is applied differently if the suffering person is from a different country to our own. This suggests a lack of moral parsimony because a factor would be taken to be morally irrelevant in the alternative moral framework is here taken to be morally relevant. How to interpret your score. The higher your percentage score, the more parsimonious your moral framework. In other words, a high score is suggestive of a moral framework that comprises a minimal number of moral principles that apply across a range of circumstances and acts. What is a high score? As a rule of thumb, any score above 75% should be considered indicative of a parsimonious moral framework. However, perhaps a better way to think about this is to see how your score compares to other people's scores. In this respect, your score of 71% is slightly higher than the average score of 61%. This suggests that you have utilized a somewhat smaller range of moral principles than average in order to make judgments about the scenarios presented in this test, and that you have, at least on occasion, judged aspects of the acts and circumstances depicted here to be morally irrelevant that other people considered to be morally relevant. Moral parsimony, good or bad. We make no judgment about whether moral parsimony is a good or bad thing. Some people will think that on balance it's a good thing, and we should strive to minimize the number of moral principles that form our moral frameworks. Others will suspect that moral parsimony is likely to render moral frameworks simplistic, and that overly parsimonious moral framework will leave us unable to deal with the complexity of real circumstances and acts. We'll leave it up to you to decide who's right. So, I mean, what was your score there, Dave?
66.
Oh. Much of a muchness.
Yeah.
There's also a load of other bits on it, but it's interesting, a couple of bits about it. Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to go through and read all of that, but it's so my score on the family of 50% is not different to the average of 49%. my geographical distance is identical to the average score in the category, 67%. So my acts and omissions, 67 is a little bit higher than. Oh, there's one. Scale. The category has to do with whether scale is a factor in making moral judgments. A simple example would make this clear. Consider a situation where it's possible to save 10 lives by sacrificing one life. Is there a moral difference between the choice? And the idea is to determine whether moral principles are applied without modification or qualification when you're dealing with sets of circumstances that differ only in their scale. Your score of 100% is a lot higher than the average score of 70% in this category. It seems that scale, as described above, is not an important consideration in your moral worldview, but if, contrary to our findings, it is important, then it decreases parsimonious of your moral framework. I mean, yeah, that's good. That was the 10% question. I said 10% is 10% is 10%. So I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, my geographical distance was 83%.
Yeah.
Family relatedness is 67%, which is higher than the 49% average. Acts and omissions is 67%, which is a little higher than the average score of
Same as my
60.
one.
And scale is 50%, significantly lower than the average score of 70%.
Interesting.
This suggests that scale is an important consideration in your moral thinking.
Fair. Yeah, really good. Right, I'm going to put us in, be right back quickly and sort out the stream, and we will have the chat.
See you later, Manny.
Have yourself a good one, dude. Right, so where we go? Let's go there. And we're back in the room. Oh, is that what you meant by your jam, Leon? Ah, I thought you were talking about the rap one was your jam, but you like that one. Okay, fair. I'll make sure I'll do that one every other. So yeah, that was interesting experiment. So of the ones that we did, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there were 5 that my mind was changed on. There were a couple that I disagreed with the consensus, but in general, all the others we were in agreement on. The scores weren't massively different either. The end.
No, not really.
Um, yeah, I
I mean,
don't.
you could have always just taken a error theorist approach and just, or a subjectivist approach and just gone, no, there's no moral obligations ever.
This is true. I'd love the exact same test as we were saying earlier, the exact same test, but with oughts instead of obligations, because it would have definitely changed some of my, if not all, of my answers. Because
Oh yeah.
there are things that I think we ought to do that we're not necessarily obligated to do. Um, there's a consistency one apparently. There's another one. Opie, I'll have a look at that one. Um,
Oh yeah, we'll do that. That
yeah,
sounds good.
yeah. No, it was quite fun. It was a great way to engage with people and get a number of answers. But yeah,
I'll go through the whole site and see what other kind of philosophical quizzes and stuff there is.
yeah. And actually, next time, guys, next time we do one of these, I'd love it if you guys, whilst we're sat there taking the quest, obviously put your answers in, but do the quiz yourself, and we can see how close all of our answers are to the end of it. Yeah, absolutely awesome. But yeah, that was interesting. A bit of a change of pace for us as well, because we've been doing a lot of reading of our own articles and things like that on a Thursday, which I think is good to do. But it's nice to break out and do something else. And I'd like to do some reviews of some videos and other sites and stuff like that as well. It's just finding the right ones.
Yeah.
And they've either got to be really good or really bad to make it worth it. Uh, you know,
Yeah.
making claims that they were Christians 500 BC.
We could do that raging atheist one who argues that um, there are things on Earth that have no causes. You know, when he does the kalam?
no, really
Yeah, he says that we don't even know if the Earth has a cause.
interesting. I mean, I think the only thing within the universe that we think doesn't have a cause currently is virtual particles. And even then, I don't know if we know for a fact that they don't have a cause.
Yeah.
Although someone said no, it's been proven that there's definitely no cause to me the other day. And it was like, cool, have you got a link to that? And their answer was do your own research.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I can really research that. Yes, I'm just going to go off and do my own research into virtual particles. Obviously, they
I mean,
meant
I'll use PhD.
yeah, YouTube PhD.
Yep.
um, we could review your videos, Luke, but I mean, we'd just be sitting there agreeing with you for the most part. So,
Yeah.
there's we need something to disagree with, really. That's why we're saying it needs to generally be really awful.
Yeah, but you see, when you disagree with me, you end up changing your mind after I say something.
Not always. There were a couple there that I still held my own with, but yes, I did change my mind 5 times.
Yep.
But yeah, but that's just it. And if there's a better argument presented to what was going on in my own head, it will change my mind. That's all it was. And if it gets to a point where I feel that they're weighted the same, I'll probably have the bias of but this one was mine and I said it first.
Yeah. Which is right.
Yeah. And do you know what? Sometimes I'll think on things as well, even if we're having a conversation, and for the conversation, I'll stand my ground. There might be something that occurs to me in the middle of the night, and I go, oh no, I should have agreed with him now. I've thought about this other thing that backs him up, and I haven't thought of anything extra that backs me up.
That's the way things work.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I might change my mind on some of these after thinking about it a bit longer.
Yeah. It'd be what would be really interesting actually is if you'd have done these questions before your bachelor's, before your master's, and then after your master's, obviously before your PhD, and then after the PhD.
Yeah.
And
I can already tell you each one would have been very different at each stage.
yeah, I can imagine they would be.
Yeah. Because I actually know some of those that I've changed my mind on since beginning the study.
Yeah, well, you even mentioned one, for example, the nationalism one.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, before I had that conversation with you about nationalism, my opinion was probably exactly how everybody in the chat was thinking about nationalism, about the white nationalism and all of that. And it's like oh, no, no, no. And then when you suggested that doing a thing on nationalism and how it could be good, and I was just like,
Are you on drugs?
well, I know you are, but you know. But the fact that there could be a form, and from what we discussed, it was very atypical of what we know of what nationalism is. See you, Luke. We're about to wrap up anyway,
later, Luke.
and he has reminded us to say that we will be seeing Luke next Tuesday. He is coming back on to continue the conversation about morality that we didn't have last time, but also talk about psychopathy. So last Tuesday we discussed, as in the Tuesday before last, should I say, we discussed consciousness and morality from a psychological perspective. We are going to be covering off more about morality from a psychological perspective and see how it marries up with philosophy, but we're also going to be delving into psychopathy. So Luke will be here, and I think Chris might join us if she's able to as well. So there could even be four of us in the room.
Nice.
Yeah. But yes, other than that, we are all good for the night. So I'd just like to thank everybody for participating. It's been great to have your answers come in. Been interesting to see your reasonings as well, and the way you've been thinking about things. It always helps me think about the way I think about things, seeing how someone else thinks about it as well. I don't think you can ever have an all-encompassing picture in your head. You know, someone will always say something in a slightly different way, or process it different, or a bit of their own experience and add that into it. And it just changes things that little bit that makes me go,
yeah.
And then you add that into your own mix, and you might come up with a different answer to them anyway, but you've added what they've said into your mix and processed it as well. So these sorts of conversations are great, and it's why I love discussing morality as well, because it's one of the things that I always find I'm having my mind changed on so much.
It's a very complicated topic, as Leon said.
Yeah, I can understand why you hate it, but that's sort of why I love it.
Yeah.
Right, well, that's it then for the night. Thank you, everybody, as I've said, and thank you to anyone that's watching the reruns. Please like, subscribe, and all that shit. And you've been watching the Fresh Air Sci-Fi stream. I'm Joe.
And I'm not a disciple of Peter Singer, obviously.
Have a good night, all.
Good night, all.